class, to remind us what we're learning about, when we observe Shemitah, the question becomes, are the fruits, let's see if I can adjust this better. The question is, are we dealing with 6th-year fruit or 7th-year fruit? And this is true for grains, and this is true for fruits and vegetables. And the Mishnah taught us 3 rules. And the rules are as follows. In determining whether fruit of a tree is 6th-year fruit or 7th-year fruit, what we do is we look at chanata, blossoming. And we saw in the Mishnah Behira on page 410, a difference of opinion of what blossoming means in halacha for purposes of identifying what year does a fruit belong to. Is it 5th-year fruit or is it 6th-year fruit? So, for example, you may have fruit that blossomed in the 6th year, halachic blossomed, and the machlokes is, what is halachic blossoming? One sheet is the Rambam, that it means when the fruit's gotten to 1/3 of its size. Another sheet is when the leaf that protects the fruit falls off and the fruit becomes exposed. Whatever the halachic definition of blossoming is, a fruit that blossoms in the 6th year, even if you pick it in the 7th year, it is 6th-year fruit, meaning it doesn't have kedushas Shviis. It is your fruit, and you don't have to leave it hefker for everyone else. On the other hand, if the fruit blossomed in the 7th year, it is Shviis fruit, kedusha Shviis. This is the rule for fruits of a tree, chanata, blossom. When we go to grain and we go to beans, we go to vegetables, the rule is lakita, when you pick it. So even if you grow potatoes and the potatoes are fully, quote unquote, they're ripe, they're mature in the 6th year, and you don't pick those potatoes until the 7th year, those potatoes will have kedusha Shviis because you picked them in the 7th year. Those are the 2 basic rules. Fruits depend on blossoming, and vegetables, grain depends on when they are picked. Those are the 2 basic rules. Not only do these rules affect Shemitah, they affect the rules of Meiser. Meiser, we went through 1st year, 2nd year, 3rd year, 4th year, 5th year, 6th year, and then Shviis. There's a 6-year cycle in the Shemitah cycle. And in the 3rd and 6th year, every year of the 6 years of the cycle, you give Meiser Rishon to the Levi. In the 1st and 2nd year, you take Meiser Sheni to Yerushalayim and you eat it yourself. The same thing is true, that's 1, 2, 3. The same thing is true for 3, 4, 5. In year 3 and 4, Meiser Rishon to the Levi, Meiser Sheni to Yerushalayim, and you eat it there. In the 6th year, Meiser Rishon to the Levi, instead of Meiser Sheni, you give Meiser Ani. So 1, 2, 3, and 4, 1, 2, 4, and 5 are the same. 3 and 6 have Meiser Ani instead of Meiser Sheni. The same question comes up. How do I know what fruit it is? So this year, we're in the 6th year of the cycle. Shemitah Be'ez Hashem will be Tavshin Pei Beis. So right now, we're in the 6th year. You are going to be picking fruit, or you pick fruit in the 6th year. When did the fruit blossom? This has nothing to do even with Shemitah anymore. If the fruit halachically blossomed in the 5th year, The fact that you pick in the 6th year is irrelevant. It's 5th-year fruit. And what do you have to do in the 5th year? Ma'aser Rishon to the Levi. Ma'aser Sheni, you take those pomegranates, some of them to Yerushalayim, and you eat in Yerushalayim. If those pomegranates ripen this year in the 6th year, then Ma'aser Rishon to the Levi, and no Ma'aser Sheni to Yerushalayim for those pomegranates. That's going to be Ma'aser Oni to the Oni. So defining when the fruit is shayach to, is it 5th-year fruit or 6th-year fruit, 2nd-year fruit or 3rd-year fruit? These are questions that get answered through chanata, blossoming for a fruit, picking for vegetables, grain, etc. Then we learned an exception to the rule, or a third rule, which is called hashrosha, and that's where we were up to. We learned already Mishnah Zayin on page 408. The Mishnah said that rice, millet, poppy, and sesame depends on hashrosha, a new word. Sorry. It depends when these things, the rice, the millet, the poppy, and the sesame, actually took root. Not when you pick it, and not when it blossoms, when it takes root. And this is the subject that's going to pick up in the Mishnah today in Mishnah Ches on page 411. But before we go to the Mishnah for today on page 411, let's remember why this rule was made, the Hashrosha rule. We have 3 categories. Anata, blossoming for the fruit of a tree. We have Lakita, collecting, picking for vegetables and grain. And now we have Hashrosha, taking root for rice, millet, poppy, and sesame. Why? We just explained that there are different maasros that are given in different years. In year 2, Ma'aser Rishon, Ma'aser Sheni. In year 3, Ma'aser Rishon, no Ma'aser Sheni, but Ma'aser Oni. In the 5th year, Ma'aser Rishon, Ma'aser Sheni. In the 6th year, Ma'aser Rishon, no Ma'aser Sheni, Ma'aser Oni. And so we have to know what year is a particular fruit or grain shayach to. So we have common denominators. Number 1, common denominator, blossoming. Common denominator, picking. Common denominator, those are the 2 basic common denominators. And this way, the person who owns a field knows what meiser to give, because there are definitions. Fruits are chanata, and vegetables, grain, are when you pick it. It's also important for a second reason, because the Gemara learns out from a pasuk, aser to aser, as called Trosar Echa Yotze Lecha Shana Shana. Every year has to take off its own meiser. So, for example, in year 1 of the cycle, you take off Ma'aser Rishon, you give it to the Levi. In year 2, you're also going to take off Ma'aser Rishon and give it to the Levi. However, that which blossomed, if we're talking about fruit, that which blossomed in year 1, you take off Ma'aser from those fruits and you give it to the Levi. That which blossomed in year 2, you take off from it and you give to the Levi. You don't mix the first year's blossomed fruit with the second year's blossomed fruit, mix them together and take off a larger quantity of Ma'aser and give it to the Levi at Ma'aser Rishon. You must take off Ma'aser Rishon Shana Shana for each year. So we need to have definitions that divide the years. These are the first year fruits because they blossomed in year 1. These are second year fruits, they blossomed in year 2. Besides the question of what Ma'aser to give, because in year 1 and year 2, it's the same thing. The year 1 and year 2, Ma'aser Rishon and Ma'aser Sheni. The change doesn't occur until year 3. So there are 2 reasons we need to have definitions. First of all, what year did it blossom? Is it year 2, year 3? Is it year 5 or year 6? But then we need to know within year 1 and 2, And within year 3 and 4, is it year 1 or 2 or year 3 or 4? Even though it's all the same Meiser, Rishon, and Sheni, you still have to take off separately for each year. So we have these different definitions, and it gives us a consistency. We know all pomegranates that blossom in year 3 are year 3, all pomegranates that blossom year 4 are year 4, and we know how to take off Meiser. The problem with rice, millet, poppy, and sesame is that they do not have a consistent point. The way they grow, even if you plant them at the same time, they ripen at different points of time. And of course, if they ripen at different points of time, the owner of the field is going to pick them at different points of time. The rice that ripens will be picked. The rice that's not ripe will not be picked. So if we look, a farmer plants a field of rice, that rice will mature at different times and will be picked at different times. So how will we know what to do with this rice field? What year is the rice that's growing in this rice field? Year 1, year 2, etc. And this is, of course, Nogea, the halachas we talked about. So in order to create a consistent point for the definition, the Chazal used the rule of Hashrasha. When did it take root? Poppy, sesame, millet, rice, you planted. As soon as it takes root, it doesn't make a difference when each of them ripen. It doesn't make a difference when you pick them. Everything that took root, and generally speaking, when you plant a whole rice field, it's going to basically take root the same point in time, within a few days. But it's the blossoming, the ripening, the picking will occur at different times, which will confuse us. So not to get confused, Chazal made the rule of Hashrasha. So if you plant a poppy field and the poppies took root before Rosh Hashanah, they're all poppies of that year. If the poppies took root after Rosh Hashanah, they're poppies of the following year. So it all depends upon when it takes root. Did it take root before Rosh Hashanah of the 5th year or after Rosh Hashanah of the 5th year? Obviously, if you plant poppy sometime in early Elul, in all likelihood, it took root in that year. The question becomes, if you plant poppies right near Rosh Hashanah, so you have to determine if it took root before Rosh Hashanah and it's poppies of that year, or it took root after Rosh Hashanah and it's poppies of the following year. And this would be true also for Shemitah. If you plant a poppy seed close to Rosh Hashanah, if the poppies took root before Rosh Hashanah, those are poppies of the 6th year and they belong to you, no Kedusha Shviis. If you planted the poppies near Rosh Hashanah and they took root after Rosh Hashanah of the 7th year, those are Shviis poppies and they are hefker. On that subject, the Mishnah now continues, page 411 of the Mishnah Behira. Rabbi Shimon Shazuri Omer, Rabbi Shimon Shazuri says, Pol HaMitzri, it's some kind of bean, we're not sure exactly what it is, but it's an Egyptian bean, that's how Chazal knew it. Shezroi Lezera Batchila Kayotze Behem. If you planted it initially, sometimes farmers plant things not to produce them, to sell them to eat. Sometimes farmers plant just to create more seed, and then from that seed, they will then plant an entire field that will grow and they will sell it for consumption. But sometimes planting is done for the sole purpose of to create more seeds. So Reb Shimon Shazuri says, Pol HaMitzri, this Egyptian bean, Shezera'o, that you planted, Lezera Betchila, initially you planted it for the sole purpose of creating more seeds, not to sell it to be eaten. Kayotze Behem, it has the same rule as the millet, the poppy, the rice, and the sesame. It goes according to this Egyptian bean. If you plant it for the purpose of creating more seed, then you go according to whether it is the hashrasha, the taking root. If you take a look in Rabbeinu Ovad Mibar Tanura, at the top of the page on the third line, Kayotze Behem, it has the same rule, this Egyptian being. Boser Hashrosha, you go according to when it took root. Ka'orez, like rice, Vidochen, and millet. Bein in Maisers, Bein in Shviis. Regarding the halachas of Maisa and regarding the halachas of Shviis, it goes according to when it took root. V'davka shezro l'zera. This is only true if you took the pole hamitzri and you planted it for the sole purpose of creating more seed. Avol zoroi liyerek, but if you planted this Egyptian bean as a vegetable to eat, azlinam basalakita kiyerek, then you're going to go according to when you pick it. That's the rule for vegetables. If you plant this Egyptian bean in order to eat it, so it's a vegetable. What year is it? When you pick it. However, if you plant this Egyptian bean for the purpose of creating more seed, then it goes according to when it took root. Rabbi Shimon says, apunin hagamlonin. It's also a kind of bean. Some people say it's a shelled, it's a afunim. It's a large kind of bean with a shell. That over time the shell hardens. And kayotze behen. Reb Shimon says the same rule for afunim hagamlonim. If you planted these afunim for the purpose of creating more seed rather than eating, then it doesn't follow the rule of vegetables of when you pick it. It follows the rule of millet, rice, poppy, sesame, and you determine the year based upon hashrosha when it took root. Rebbe Loza disagrees, and he says, afunim hagamlonim, these afunim beans, misha tirmalu. The way you determine what year it is, if you plant it for the purpose of creating seed. Remember, if you plant a vegetable for the sole purpose of eating it, you determine the year of Meiser, and you determine Shviis based upon when you pick it. But if you plant one of these things for the purpose of creating more seed, then the first sheet in the Mishnah is you go according to the Hashrosha, when it took root. Rebbe Loza says that apunim hagamlonim, if you plant it for the purpose of creating more seed, mishatirmalu, from the point that the outside, the sort of the case that these beans grow in, when it gets very, very hard, at that point, that is the year, Lefnei Rosh Hashanah. If it takes, the shell gets so hard that you really can't eat it anymore before Rosh Hashanah, it's apunim of that year. If the apunim shell gets hard after Rosh Hashanah, it's apunim of that year. Depends when the shell got hard. That's Rebbe Loza Shita. We're not exactly sure what these apunim are. Again, I emphasize, this is when these things are planted to create more seed. If they are planted for consumption like a vegetable, they have the halacha of a vegetable, which you determine based upon lakita when you pick it. Now we're going into Mishnah Test. And Mishnah Test is going to start us, actually continue the discussion about watering, which is going to be a big sugya for us since many of us have gardens, we have trees. What can I do during the seventh year? What can I do during Shemitah to water my tree or water my garden? I have plants, I have natural grass. We're not going to get to the halakha today, but the issue of watering continues. Remember, we learned in the introduction to the Masechta, and we learned it as we were learning the Masechta, Midoraisa, biblically, there are only 4 things that can't be done in a field during Shemitah, and those are the 4 things that Torah specifically says in Parshas Bahar. You can't prune your vine. You can't harvest the grain. You can't plant. And you can't pick the fruits. There's There's no biblical prohibition on actually watering a field or a tree. That's rabbinically prohibited. And the question always becomes, what did the Rabbanim prohibit? So when we started the sugya of water a week or two ago, we discussed the difference that was going to come up in the Masech, and we already touched upon it, the difference between trying to make the field grow better versus trying to make the field, avoiding damage to the field. I'm sorry, the four malachas that are asa midoraisa, the four biblically prohibited malachas are pruning your vineyard, cutting off the dry branches, harvesting grain, picking grapes, and planting. Those are the four. Watering is not one of the four biblical malachas. So it's prohibited midrabanan. And we know that there's an area that the Rabbanan said that, as we say so many times, the purpose of Shemitah is not that Rebbeinu Shalom wants to see Eretz Yisrael go desolate and destroyed and shmama, chas v'shalom. The point here is you can't do things midrabanan that are going to make the field grow better, make the tree grow better. If there are things that need to be done, because otherwise it will damage, die, then you are permitted to do that, generally speaking, in Shemitah. What are those rules? We'll learn as we go through the Masechta, but we're about to touch now again on the issue of watering. Mishnah Test, page 411. Habetzolim hasarisim, a certain kind of onion, upol hamitzri, and that Egyptian bean, shemona mehem mayim shloshim yom, lifnei Rosh Hashanah. You didn't water them for 30 days before Rosh Hashanah. Vegetables generally do not grow well in Eretz Yisrael from rain itself. The rainwater is good for trees, it's good for vegetables, but generally speaking, it's good for trees, it's good for flowers, it's good for fruit, but generally speaking, vegetables need to be irrigated, they need to be watered in addition to the rainwater. So that's the normal thing for vegetables. They live off the rainwater, and you also irrigate them, you water them. That becomes the definition of a vegetable. And this is a Gemara in Rosh Hashanah. The Gemara talks about at what point something is a vegetable, at what point does it, quote unquote, it can lose its identity as a vegetable. And that's one of the issues in this Mishnah. You take a vegetable, it needs to be watered by the rain, and it needs to be irrigated, whether the human being, you can see in picture 58 on page 412, you have a human being in those days bringing out buckets of water to water his vegetables. However it's being irrigated, that's a vegetable. But now the Mishnah is describing there are vegetables that can actually, it is possible to cut off the watering, and they will live. Now, what happens if you cut off the watering for such vegetables? Is it still considered a quote-unquote vegetable? Because you're not watering it anymore. It almost takes on the identity of a tree that's living off rainwater. So the Mishnah now says on page 411, Habetzolim hasarisim, these kind of onions, a special kind of onion, upol hamitzri, and that Egyptian bean, it is possible to cut off the water and they will live. And if you do so, these two things will have a new halacha. Shemona mehem mayim shloshim yom lifnei Rosh Hashanah. If you cut off the water from these two things for 30 days before Rosh Hashanah, starting Rosh Chodesh Elul, you shut off the irrigation system, or you stop bringing buckets of water into this onion field or into this Egyptian bean field. So for 30 days before Rosh Hashanah, it was not irrigated, it was not watered. Misashrin l'sha'ava. The result of that is these two things now get the halacha of a tree field, and they are no longer dependent on when you pick them, and they will be considered the fruit, quote unquote, of the year before. So let's take an example. Sixth year now. Well, let's take it further. Rosh Chodesh Elul Habo Leinu L'Toiva. Rosh Chodesh Elul this year, coming up. A person stops, he has a field of this kind of special onion, or he has a field of this kind of Egyptian bean, and 30 days before Rosh Hashanah, let's call it Rosh Chodesh Elul, he shuts off the irrigation machines, he stops bringing water to these two things. These two things will be considered sixth-year onions and sixth-year Egyptian beans and have no Kedusha Shviis. Even if you pick it in the seventh year, they will be considered sixth-year Egyptian beans and sixth year these type of onions, because by stopping to irrigate them 30 days before Rosh Hashanah, they no longer have, quote unquote, the definition of halachic vegetables. They were not irrigated, and therefore they have the halacha of sixth-year onions and sixth-year Egyptian beans. And what Meiser do you take off? Sixth-year Meiser, which is Meiser Rishon and Meiser Ani. In addition to that, because they're sixth-year onions and sixth-year Egyptian beans, they belong to you and they have no Kedusha Shviis. So let's read that again on page 411. Habetzolim hasarisim, these kind of onions, upol hamitzri, and this Egyptian bean, shemolim mehemayim shloshim yom lefnei Rosh Hashanah, that you didn't water, you stopped irrigating them 30 days before Rosh Hashanah, misashrim lisha'ova, you take off Maisa for the year before, meaning this year, if you planted them this year and you stop watering them Rosh Chodesh Elul that's coming up, then they are sixth-year onions, sixth-year Egyptian beans. Not next year, this year, even if you pick them next year. And for vegetables, we always go when you pick them, not in this case, because by cutting off the irrigation and cutting off watering them, they lose the status of the vegetable that you go when you pick them, and it goes according to when they actually were blossomed or ripened. Now, don't apply this rule across the board. Please don't walk away from the Mishnah saying that any vegetables that I stop watering 30 days before Rosh Hashanah has the halacha of sixth-year vegetables and not Shemitah vegetables. Don't generalize. There's a special halacha for this kind of onion and a special halacha for this kind of Egyptian bean. V'im lav, the Mishnah now says on page 412, and if you didn't cut off the watering, you watered them during the 30 days, asur b'shviis, they have the kedusha shviis, and you're prohibited from using them. We talked about this. A person that owns the field, he can go into his own field and he can pick what's in the field. It's hefka for everybody. It doesn't mean that the owner can't pick pomegranates in his own field during Shviis. How much can he pick? We're going to learn later in the Maseches. But it has kedusha Shviis. U'misashrin l'shana haba. And because you continued watering it, so it's going to have the halacha of a vegetable. And if it has the halacha of the vegetable, the meiser you're going to take off is for the following year. So if you have this onion or this Egyptian bean, and you watered it you watered it through Elul of, let's say, the 5th year, and you pick it in the 6th year, those are onions and Egyptian beans of the 6th year. They're regular vegetables. It goes according to when you pick it. V'shel Baal, and if you have a field that's called a Baal field, A Baal field is a field that's basically in a valley. Fields that are in the valley get a tremendous amount of water because during the rainy season, the rains gather at the top of the mountains, they run down the mountains, and they absorb into the fields that are in the valley. Nevertheless, when you plant vegetables in such a valley, generally speaking, you still have to irrigate and water them. So if you want to convert this kind of field in a valley to be, quote unquote, a tree field rather than a vegetable field, the Mishnah says, Shemona mehem shtei onos, divrei Reb Meir. You have to stop watering them 2 times. In other words, if the normal period to water such a field is every 30 days, you would have to stop watering it for 60 days. Why? The difference between the Egyptian bean and the onion is that they grow in a regular field and they're living basically off rainwater and what the water that you irrigate it with. If you stop irrigating the onion and you stop irrigating the Egyptian bean field for 30 days, it's no longer a vegetable field, and therefore it gets the halacha of a tree field, so to speak. Whereas a field that's growing in a valley, even if you don't irrigate it for 30 days, it has plenty of natural water from all the water that seeped down over the rainy season into the ground. So such a field that has so much water in it anyway, if you want to convert it halachically from the onion field or the Egyptian bean field, you're going to have to stop watering it for 2 periods. So if the normal irrigation period is every 30 days, the owner of the field comes out there with buckets of water, he would have to stop watering it for 60 days. So if these things are growing in a valley, then you would stop watering it for 60 days before. And if you do that, whatever grows there then has the halacha of 6-year onion, 6-year Egyptian bean. If you water it during the 60 days in the valley, then it's going to have the status of Shviis if you pick it in Shviis. Reb Meir, that's Reb Meir's opinion. The Chachamim omim shalosh. The Chachamim are more machmir. The Chachamim say if you want to convert this kind of field that's growing in the valley, it's not enough to stop 60 days before, and I'm just picking that number now. I'm assuming for purposes of our discussion now that it's 30 days for each watering. So 60 days are 2 waterings. The Chachamim say no, you have to stop three periods, which means 90 days before Rosh Hashanah. If you stop watering this field in the valley for 90 days before Rosh Hashanah, whatever grew has the status of that year. If you water it during the 90 days, it has the status of the following year, and that's true again for Meiser and for Shemitah. Remember, whenever we talk about these halachas, we're talking about 2 things. Meiser, I need to know what year these fruits are for purposes of taking off Meiser. And then between the 6th year and the 7th year, I have another question. Is it 6th-year growth or is it Shemitah growth? So these definitions, blossoming, hachanata, lakita, picking, hashrosha, taking root, stopping watering, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, all these issues resolve 2 problems. Meiser, what year is it for Meiser? And do these vegetables or fruits have Kedushas Shviis? Okay, we'll stop here for today. There's one more Mishnah on this subject, which is Mishnah Yud. And then the Perek Gimel begins about something that we said was going to become a very major issue in Maseches Shviis, and that is the issue of Maris Ayin. When you do things people looking and seeing what you're doing can get the wrong impression that you're doing something that violates Shviis. And this concerned Chachamim a great deal. We said we would discuss that, and that's what we're going to get to in Perek Gimel.